Okay, so we are looking at the research summaries part of this practice CCRX assessment here. So again, the research summaries part is going to assess all of these highlighted skills. And in order to, be competent at these skills, we need to have some clarity about what they are so we can, come up with strategies for how to do them. So, research summaries. Again, the basic format of this part of the test, there will be a paragraph describing some background information, be experiment 1 describing what was done, a table that goes with the results of experiment 1, a description for experiment 2, and a table for experiment 2. The first question, and that's assessing SIN 202. SIN 202 is understand tools and functions of tools. So basically that question often is framed up, what are the purpose of materials in the experiment? So in the question that I asked, it says, what was the purpose of the citric acid being added to the milk in the experiments? And as you read through this first paragraph, it talks about acid, and it's added to mimic the conditions of a calf's stomach. The next question is SIN 301. SIN 301 is a skill about understanding methods in an experiment. So oftentimes those types of questions ask about how many of something were used. So the question I posed was, what was the total amount of skim milk used in both experiments? So the total amount used, understanding methods, you need to figure out how much skim milk was used in this, how much skim milk was used in this, add it up, and that'll help you with your answer. The next question, SIN 401, it is to understand experimental design, and most of those questions will have to do with identifying variables. So in this question, it asks, what was the independent variable in experiment 1? So you're focused on experiment 1. The independent variable is that which is manipulated in the setup. So that is, even on most tables, you can find that because it'll be on the left or X side of the table. The next question is SIN 404, which is about identifying similarities and differences. And this gets into basically, it's pretty self-explanatory. How are the two experiments different? So the question for this practice one is, how did experiment 1 differ from experiment 2? And you guys can come up with understanding that. Simply looking at the tables, you can see the differences here. But based on the choices, you need to kind of see, okay, what was done here, what was done here, which one is actually different. But going through the choices one at a time and eliminating choices is a good way to answer that question. The next question is an EMI question. It's EMI 401, which is to determine which conclusion is consistent with the data. And basically, a lot of times that format is like, which explanation best describes the results of like experiment 1 for trial 2 or something like that. So in our practice one, it is, which conclusion is consistent with the results of the experimental trial when 3 milliliters of rennet was added to skim milk. Again, it's straightforward, but you need to find the right experiment, and you need to find the right experimental trial, and then choose the right conclusion that goes with that. The next question is SIN 503. And again, as we get to the higher level of SIN questions, a lot of times it's not a question that's applied directly to the experiments that are explained. But if you understand these results, you can apply and anticipate the results for hypothetical experiments. And SIN 503 is getting in that direction. So the SIN 503 is to determine the experimental conditions that would produce the specified results. So basically, a lot of times that question looks like, if experimental was performed at the conditions for experimental 2, which trial would most likely end up in a certain way? So I framed it on this time. If chocolate milk, right here, had 4 milliliters of rennet added to it, approximately how much whey would you expect to collect after the cheese was produced? So we need to look at volume of whey with chocolate milk and then predict how that would be for 3 milliliters of rennet. SIN 502 is to predict the results of an additional trial or measurement. So if you had, like in experiment 1, if an additional measurement was taken beyond those listed, what would be the expected results? And in this sample question, I said if 6 milliliters of rennet was added to skim milk and the procedure was followed as in experiment 2, approximately how long do you think it would take to complete the chemical reaction? So this SIN is predict something beyond the actual experiment based off of the trend that you see in the data. The next question here is EMI 505. It is determine which results support or contradict a conclusion. That's the skill. So again, it can be supporting or contradicting, and for this question, I said which experimental conditions would support the following results. It takes 42 seconds to produce 26 grams of curds. Again, these higher level SIN questions are blending results from both of these experiments in a hypothetical situation. So 42 seconds is going to have to do with the amount of rennet used, and 26 grams of curds is going to have to do with the type of milk. Finally, we have the SIN 703. 703 is meant to be a fairly advanced skill area. So 703, the skill is determine which additional trial or experiment could be performed to enhance or evaluate the results of the original experiment. So if some of the results do not support the predicted scientific outcome, what additional trial or experiment would provide clarity? The way I frame it in this one, I talk about cow and goat milk. So I say cows and goats differ, although they are both in the mammalian family of Bovidae. Cows and goats differ slightly in their body temperature, which is going to come up in the answer, as well as in the nutritional contents of the milk. Cow's milk contains 276 milligrams of calcium and 8 grams of protein in 276 milliliters of milk, like one serving. Goat's milk contains more calcium, 327 milligrams, and more protein, 9 grams of protein, in that same amount of serving. Therefore, the scientists conducting experiment 1 predicted that the cheese made from goat's milk would have the greatest mass of curds when cheese was produced. If experiment 1 was repeated for multiple trials and the results proved valid, explain an additional experimental setup that would provide clarity about the differences in cheese production from cow versus goat milk. That's a bit of a doozy. So again, what it's saying is that this is not turning out the way that the original scientists expected it to. Since it did not turn out that way, how could you redo it in some way without just redoing the exact same thing in order to try and bring clarity? And it has to do with changing the temperature. So that's it for the research summaries section of the test.